thank you so much for coming along and spending the day with us.
A pleasure. I love Crawley.
Where better? Creepy Crawley. So much to ask you. First of all, I'm interested to know what influences you creative people. So can I ask about your childhood, your family background? What was that consist of?
I had a terrible childhood. I guess I was a single child up until the age of 11, and although I was, I had lots of friends at school, I wasn't a sort of quiet child by any means, but I think I lived a lot in my imagination, and I was quite a precocious reader. I remember my father, was a reasonably educated man, and there were, a few books in the house, a sort of eclectic mix. I even remember at the age of 9 trying to struggle through this French grammar book and teaching my, so that I would read anything, basically. But I remember there were some quite interesting books there, and I remember reading Brave New World about the age of 10.
Wow.
Which was, and I can remember bits of it even now, particularly about the pneumatic lady. I mean, that rang a bell even when I was 10. I can see you all know that book.
And was it fiction and fact, or purely fiction, or that you read?
Well, no, fiction. And I can remember comics, and particularly annuals. Nowadays you call them graphic novels, but I remember reading all the classics, like the Dickens classics, Oliver Twist, in this, sort of cartoon graphic form. They were wonderful, and so I kind of, and I was mad on King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table, because I went to Tintagel with my father on holiday, and so I was reading a lot from an early age. I had a lot of King Arthur stories, stuff like that, and a bit of science fiction. So that's sort of stuck around with me. And the other thing which I have mentioned is that, I was a radio child. I didn't really look at television until I was about 14. And so everything was radio. There was all the comedy shows from after the war, like Itmar and the one with Jimmy Edwards, Take It From Here, I think it was, and Jim Whitfield and everybody. And, things like Journey into Space, Dick Barton, and you had to wait after the cliffhanger, and it was such a long time when you were a child to wait for the next episode. Dick Barton was every night. It was before The Archers. I don't know why they chose The Archers after. Dick Barton. Yeah, it was Dick Barton's special agent, and it was so exciting. So, all that fed in really to my kind of very, very early influences. Yeah.
And were you always interested in being in television, or were you interested in radio before that?
No, I think, the idea that you could have a career in media just didn't exist in my day. I think that I thought I would be a journalist for a while, because somebody bought me a book about journalism, and I thought, oh yeah, that's quite good. And I guess when I got a bit older and began to read more literature, French, German literature and English literature, doing my A-levels and everything, I suppose I had a vague idea that something creative to do with the written word might be a sort of a career, but I didn't think about it. Television, I didn't really think about television until I was at university. And I thought, there's a career called television, you can do this. Funnily enough, I was up in Manchester yesterday with a very good friend of mine, a writer, William Humble, who wrote On Giants' Shoulders, and then he wrote lots of stuff on television. And he wrote a wonderful screen too for me called Virtuoso, about John Ogden, who was a very well-known concert pianist. And I was talking, and Bill's a wonderful writer, and I remember when I first met him, he told me about when he first went to Birmingham University. The first day he was there, and he met the director, Tony Smith, who became a good mate, and he directed Virtuoso. And they met in the lift, and he met for the first time, and Tony Smith said, what are you doing? And I'm doing literature. Said, Bill. And so Tony Smith said, there's some bugger who's even written a novel before he's come up. And Bill said, yeah, that's me. So he'd written a novel at the age of 18. Well, I wasn't that kind of person. I wasn't bursting with, I hadn't written a novel by the age of 18, but I kind of knew that I was going to go somewhere into that sort of area.
Sure.
Yeah.
And you, am I right?
And actually, I suppose the other thing was, I did think very seriously about an artistic career, because I was very good at art, and I did think about going to art school briefly, actually. But and so television was, pictures, stories,
And you became, am I right in thinking you became a teacher?
No.
No?
Oh, well, I did it part-time while I was trying to get into television.
Oh, right. The television was always the intent, even when you were teaching.
Oh, no, I never wanted to be a teacher.
Right. So how did that happen?
Sorry about teachers. I mean, I really admire teachers, but no, not for me.
So how did that happen that you were doing something you didn't want to...
Well, because I left university and I was a bit laid back, really. I didn't organise a job. I mean, these days, people organise jobs. But this was the 60s. The zeitgeist was laid back and, it'll happen kind of thing. And then I suddenly realised, my God, I've got a degree and I haven't got a job. So I started looking. By then I knew I wanted to get into television, but it's just not easy to get into television. It's not easy today, and it wasn't easy then. So I did the rounds, and I had to earn a living. So I taught in a crammer in North London, just teaching people A-level English and stuff and French, while I was doing the rounds, trying to get into television. And it took me the best part of a year to get a job.
Okay. And then what was that first break into television?
First break was that there was an opportunity in the story department or script department of ATV, which is one of the ITV companies based in Elstree, and it was a really good job because a lot of the companies had unsolicited scripts that were sent in by would-be writers, and also ideas coming from professional writers and submitted by them or by their agents, and so there was a department that dealt with this. And these days you'd call it development. Looking for new projects, things like that, and every television company has got that. So that was interesting, because with my background, I could do that. But also, the other half of my job was to sort of negotiate the deals for writers. So I got to know all the agents, and I got to know very quickly how television worked. But I wasn't on the floor in a production role, if you know what I mean. I was in this sort of writing, script editorish side of it. But then I became a script editor, started writing, putting ideas in, and then one day somebody said, well, would you like to be a sort of assistant producer? So I did that, and sort of worked my way up the tree, as it were, and then I got this offer to do Doctor Who.
Sure, and how did that come about?
Well, because I ran out of options at ATV. They were offering me stuff I didn't want to do, go back and produce Crossroads or something, I can't remember. And so I thought it's time to get out. And so I found an agent, and the agent luckily knew Bill Slater, who was head of series at the BBC, and they were looking for a new producer for the programme. And nobody's ever said this to me, but I've always guessed that the house producers didn't want the job because it's a dodgy, a lot of people weren't interested in science fiction, really. I mean, I remember a few years before that taking an idea to the controller of ATV and saying, what about doing, something on science fiction? I can't remember exactly what the idea was. And he said, nobody watches science fiction, nobody will ever watch it, it's not, anyway popular on television. And so that was the kind of atmosphere. So it's difficult to find a producer who wanted to do the programme because they were interested in the subject, but also it was a real beast to produce. It was a difficult show to run. Yeah.
And that didn't discourage you at all, the fact that other people weren't interested in it?
No, I didn't know that.
I see.
My surmise now.
Right.
No, I thought they chose me because I was so brilliant.
And so then you became producer of Doctor Who, of course.
Yeah.
And your first days doing that, you trailed Barry Letts, presumably?
Oh, yes, yeah.
How long for?
Luckily or not luckily, longer than was planned.
Okay.
Because I was... Bill Slater had lined me up with a nice lovely show, which was an adaptation of a Muriel Spark book called The Girls of Slender Means. It's a lovely period piece set in the Second World War, and a wonderful director, Moira Armstrong, already. And he said, well, you can produce that and find your feet in the BBC, and then you'll be ready to run Doctor Who. But there was a strike.
Okay.
And so I lost that production because it was killed off, or it was postponed anyway. And by that time, I couldn't produce it and produce Doctor Who. But it gave me a longer time to follow Barry, which was invaluable.
And what
I had to learn. I mean, I'd come from a smallish, well, no, a big ITV company, but small compared with the BBC. You have to learn, you know, how the BBC works.
Mm-hmm. And what sort of time frame are you talking about for showing?
April. I went into BBC in April, and we were kind of prepping through the summer, weren't we, and shooting in the autumn, I think. Yeah.
Okay, so at the end of John Pertwee's time, or
yes, I overlapped, with the spider story.
Sure.
And he did, and then Barry produced the first story where I don't know, Terence is in the room. Terence Dix's robot, where the big robot.
Yes.
And so I was there while they were doing that.
Mm-hmm. And were you always aware that it was Tom Baker that was going to be John Pertwee's replacement?
Yes, they'd cast him by the time they cast me.
So how did you feel then, by the time you took over the show yourself with Ark in Space, were you chomping at the bit to have it as your baby,
yes.
or were you a bit
No, because of all that interim time, I'd really had time to really think about what I wanted to do with the show. And I've written about this and spoken about it before, so yeah, it was great. I had a good idea of what I wanted to do, and so the thing was to make the best of what was there for the first season that I'd inherited, and then I could start commissioning my own stuff.
Sure. And as far as the stuff you inherited is concerned, a lot of old returning villains in that, which obviously is very popular, but not something you did very much again.
No.
You're not keen on it?
Well, no. I mean, it's like moving on, isn't it? You know, they've done that, so let's leave that for a bit, you know. You can always come back to it. I mean, in the new series, they've come back to the Cybermen, they've come back to the Daleks,
sure.
and they made a great success of that. But I wasn't going to just carry on with that.
And did you make a decision to consciously not do that? Because there's so many brand new villains in your time.
Yeah. I also made a decision not to have every villain a sort of an actor in a rubber suit. I thought there was a way of creating something which was mysterious and frightening and alien in different components. It doesn't have to always be personalised in a sort of funny monster.
And it's a very distinct change of tone with the Ark in Space. That was obviously a very very definite decision on your part. And throughout your entire era on the show, the house style again is very distinct and of a standard. What I mean is, in other times of the show, it's less typical. There's lots of different.
Yeah, I'm glad you noticed that. It was deliberate. Yeah.
And so tell me about that. What sort of influences did you have? What sort of considerations did you have on having that style?
I came back to the visual thing. I realised how important design was in order to create a convincing world wherever you were. You know? So that became a big priority. Cliffhangers, I was absolutely, really tighten up the stories, make them not flabby, so that you keep the audience on the hook. Surprise them whenever you can, and take more stories into science fiction areas, and then exploring in another way some historical settings, which Bob Holmes was very much against, because his experience of historical stories previously had been that they didn't work.
Okay.
They were boring. But I said, no, there's a way we can do this. We bring the science fiction element really into it. And, we discovered it. I think the first one we did was Pyramids of Mars. It really worked. And so we repeated that. So, yeah, there was sort of various things that really worked.
And tell me about working with Robert Holmes and his influence.
I was so fortunate. I can't claim all the credit for my era without, including Bob's influence. I mean, he was terrific. I mean, he was my go-to writer. He was almost like a showrunner of today. I mean, he was the principal writer. I suppose I was very severe about the standard of scripts. I mean, I know we had our hits and we had our misses, but overall, we really didn't go with a bad script, unless we were really forced to sort of, we ran out of time, which happened now and again. So I think that, and Bob was the way that I got those scripts to an extra level, because that he would do rewrites, to get it up, and to that more into our house style, if you like. And he also did complete rewrites of some.
Sure. There's photographs of you on location on Dartmoor for the Sontaran experiment.
Yeah.
Were you quite a hands-on producer like that generally, or was it that particular show you went with? Or
well, I had to be there because we were shooting that with lightweight cameras. So actually, if I wasn't there, I wouldn't see it.
Sure.
Because you had to watch it as it was happening. So it was almost like a mobile studio.
Oh, okay.
But other than that, I didn't often go on location. We always did a little bit of filming. Well, Seas of Doom, that was shot in the same way, with also a lot of studio. And so during the OB scenes of Seas of Doom, I was there all the time as well. Yeah.
And what sort of considerations do you give to getting different writers and directors in the mix when producing a whole series? Are you looking for contrasting styles, or
get the directors who can do it?
Or
I mean, you have to persuade. There are only some directors who could do it.
And when you say do it, what do you mean?
Well, finish the show to a certain standard, and others who didn't get it. You had to cast a director to the type of story. So, I mean, Paddy Russell was, a sort of straightforward drama director. She wasn't a sci-fi fan. She wasn't, up on all that. Whereas Michael Bryant would be doing blue screen and God knows what, and fantastic. So he was good for that sort of story. He was brilliant for Robots of Death. But Paddy had other strengths, and so what you do is you try and cast the director with the story.
Sure.
That was, but also a lot of directors couldn't hack it basically.
Because of the technicalities of the program?
Yeah, and the pressures, just the pressures of doing it. So that was the first thing, get good caliber directors, otherwise you were sunk, really. The other thing was get the best writers, or at least keep the scripts up to scratch. What was the question?
Well, I was going to go on to say, linking to that, would you shape out a series as to the type of stories you wanted to have?
Yeah, we did. We didn't sit there and wait for someone to pitch a story in. We would map out in general terms ideas that we think would work, and then somebody sometimes would come in with not often, but like Chris Boucher, for example, came in with a story. Terry Nation, did his own thing. Once he was asked to do a story, he did it in his own way. But we had quite a hands-on influence on all the other story ideas, yeah.
And is that not plots, but just the components of the story?
Well, no, and then the plots. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Oh, yeah.
So quite a
oh God, yeah. You don't just sit there and say, "Oh, how's that gone?" No, you really, it's hands-on stuff.
Sure. And now tell me about the regular team that you inherited: Tom Baker, Elizabeth Sladen, and Ian Marter. What did you think were the pluses about that trio?
Well, they gelled very well. Yeah. The thing is, Ian, everybody knows this, Ian was cast because they didn't know who the Doctor was going to be. And there was rumours about the casting might be older actors who couldn't do much running around and knocking people out and chasing.
Sure.
And so they thought, Bob Holmes said, he's invented this younger, more active companion to do all the running around. And so that's why the Ian Marter character was invented. And unfortunately, when I came along and then Tom had been cast, I thought, well, we don't need that character really. But it was a lovely sort of mix while they were together.
And you were with the show for 3 years.
Yeah, 2.5 actually. Yeah.
And during that time, infamously, Mary Whitehouse often commented.
We're going
on
over
your
the
shows.
same old material here.
Oh, are we? Oh, beg your pardon. Much of it I've not heard, so forgive me.
Oh, right, okay.
Forgive me. Well,
They've heard it. That's
right. Okay. Well, let's jump to the end of your time on Doctor Who then. Tell us about that and handing over to Graham Williams.
Well, it was all on and off. Was I on it? Was I off it? And then basically what happened was Bill Slater, the head of series, decided to swap me and Graham Williams. So Graham Williams was developing a police show, and I was on Doctor Who, and he decided to swap us because we were both junior, producers, and that's what he did. So he said, "I'd like you to do this police show, and I want Graham to do this." Subsequently, people have sort of seen the hand of upper BBC management in all this, and let's get that Hinchcliffe off the show. We can't, rely on him. He's upsetting Mary Whitehouse and all the rest of it. Whether how much truth there is in that, I don't know. But anyway, that happened.
It certainly wasn't something that was obvious at the time, or prevalent at the time. Sure.
No.
Okay, and then you went after. Was it Target you went on to?
Yeah.
And then your career took you to what other shows did you produce?
Well, I then did. After that, I did. I came up with an idea to do historical sort of. I thought I'd like to do something big and successful and a big drama sort of spectacle. I came up with the idea of telling the story of Nancy Astor, who was the first woman MP to take her seat. She was married to Waldorf Astor and Clifton, had a big salon and all that, and it was reasonably successful, but we did have problems with the original casting and all the rest of it. So it wasn't a smash hit, but that was the next thing I did. And then I was asked to do a BBC Two type drama, which was again, well, it was BBC Two, but although in those days you used to get 6 million on BBC Two, based on C.P. Snow's novels, which included The Masters, famous stories set in the Cambridge or Oxbridge College, and the Corridors of Power, about the Labour government during the 50s developing the atom bomb, and the major character there was a guy called Roger Quaife, and I was able to persuade Tony Hopkins to take that. I mean, he came back from Hollywood, which he hadn't worked out, and he was about to do some theatre work. In the end, he went to do Pravda at the National Theatre and rebuilt his career back in this country. And so he was up for stuff, and I managed to somehow cobble enough money together to pay, although he did it, not for his Hollywood fee, but we managed to get enough money to get him. So that was a very interesting thing, and Nigel Havers was in that. I'd cast him as one of the sons in the Astor series, so I got to know Nigel quite well, and then he was in this series called Strangers and Brothers, which was very good. It was really the last big drama series. There were 13 episodes done in the studio with multi-camera that the BBC ever did. And after that, all the major, apart from soap operas, the major drama then shifted onto film very slowly. In fact, it disappeared. People didn't do as much.
Sure.
And so then, as you know, we were talking earlier, I then worked with Nigel again.
On The Charmer?
Yes.
Which, as we were saying before, I've just rewatched, and as I mentioned, some of it's bitingly vicious, his character, isn't it? Really against type. Must have been an interesting show to put together.
Well, it was. I decided to leave the BBC, and I had an idea of my own, which was a comedy drama that I'd written, and I took it to Nick Elliott, controller of drama at London Weekend, and he said, "Yes, I'd like this. I'll buy it from you." And because I'm looking for a vehicle for Paul Nicholas, who, Just Good Friends, comedy actor, and I said, "Can I do it all on film?" He said, "Sorry, no, we can't afford film, but you can do a lot on this lightweight camera, outside and the rest in the studio." So I said, "I'll do that." He said, "Meanwhile, I'd like you to produce this. Have a look at this." And they were 2 scripts written by Alan Pryor, a very famous veteran writer who'd done Z Cars, Softly Softly, and lots of stuff. Very, very good writer. And he had adapted a book written by Patrick Hamilton, the man who wrote Rope, Hangover Square, and it was based on a character. There are two novels with this character Gores. One is West Pier, and the other is the Mr. Gorse and Mr. Stimpson. And he'd taken the second book and begun to sort of adapt it. And funnily enough, it was a project that I'd wanted to do at the BBC and tried to get it off the ground, based on the character, and had failed. They said, "Yeah, it's interesting, you know." And then, lo and behold, I was being offered these scripts, which was fantastic. And so then I took it on, and we developed the rest of the scripts, which were new ideas, and the whole thing. So the first 2 or 3 episodes were based on a real novel, Patrick Hamilton's novel. And then after that, Alan Pryor, with my help, developed other storylines to take him to the end. I don't want to spoil the ending. If you hands up, everybody who knows the ending. No, you probably don't even know the show, but it's on DVD. Anyway, he comes to a sticky end. Let's put it like that. Nigel Havers. But it did show a much dark. I think it's the best role he's ever done.
It's terrific.
And he's remembered as the charmer. But instead of being this superficial charmer, there's this sort of hidden psychopath underneath, and it was shot in a very sort of film noir way, even though it was with electronic cameras, by a wonderful director, Alan Gibson, who actually was not very well when he was doing it.
Oh, really?
And we knew that, and we had to support him, but he did a fantastic job.
Nigel Havers and Tom Baker and Anthony Hopkins among them, of course. You've worked with some really striking leading men. What is it that makes a leading actor that sets them apart from other players, do you think? Or is it just the casting? Or is it something about these people that makes them obviously leaders?
Well, you know, I don't know that there's a simple answer to that, because I suppose if you took somebody like Nigel or Paul Nicholas, let's say, people talk about actors who act on centre, or are they able to act off-centre? So on-centre means most of the time, most of the character that they're inhabiting is largely the persona that they bring, if you know what I mean.
Yes, yes.
But if you go to a Laurence Olivier or whatever, they can take on a completely different persona, so they're way off-centre. And so I would sort of say, and a lot of Hollywood stars, I would say, you know, play on centre, like Tom Cruise and, you know, people like that.
Sort of personality playing.
Yeah, a bit more than, you know, better than that. But, I mean, Leonardo DiCaprio, I think, is a phenomenal actor. I mean, why he didn't win the Oscar for The Wolf of Wall Street, I really don't know. I mean, if you've never seen the movie, watch it. It's the most fantastic performance. But, of course, he's a very unpleasant character.
Sure.
And I think what happens is the American members of the the Academy, they don't like to give the Oscar to an unpleasant character, but he's a wonderful actor, Leonardo DiCaprio. So Tony Hopkins is like that. He can inhabit. I mean, look, he was Hannibal Lecter. He was the lead in Pravda. He was Remains of the Day. I mean, he can, he's a chameleon and yet very powerful. Something very powerful about it. It was interesting working with Tony Hopkins, who I got to know very well for a while, because in the early days, he said, I can't quite get this character. He said, I'm thinking about it. And then he came up to me one day and said, I've got it. And he works from the physical. So I know how he sits in the chair. I know, and I know now how he's going to get up and walk. And so he suddenly latched onto the character in that way. So it's really interesting. So it wasn't intellectual. It wasn't, what's driving this character with ideas and all the rest of it. It was, for him, for this character, it was what was the body like that he was inhabiting?
And it took a while to develop.
It took a week or so to get it. And then he was just fantastic.
And then when you went on to producing films, did you find that is there a huge difference between producing for television and for film? Or is it scale that's different? Or are there different skills, that you have to employ with one and not the other?
Yeah, I mean, now it's getting nearer and nearer to be the same almost. But I would say the big difference is the actual production skills are the same, but scale does come into it.
Oh, okay.
but I've never, I mean, I'm not really a film producer. I've been involved in trying to mount a number of films that never got made, and then, you know, a couple that did. The big difference, being a film producer, is really how do you finance the film?
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a big part of the job is getting the finance for the movie in place before you then go off and make it. I'd say that's the major difference. Yeah.
And then after, which was your last film? Was that Awfully Big Adventure?
Yeah, well, yeah.
And then you went to, was it BBC Scotland or ITV Scotland?
No, what did I do after that?
Executive produced for Rebus?
Yeah, I'm just trying to think. Yes, it would be after that. Yes, I then eventually became controller of drama for Scottish television for about, I don't know, 3 years, three and a half years. Yeah. So I had to run Taggart, you know, breathe life into Taggart, which was still very popular. And, you know, I think we made it a bit more gritty again.
Okay.
It's a very melodramatic sort of idea, but very popular. So we kept that going, and then I brought a few stars in, because that was a way you could kind of get shows commissioned then by ITV. So we had a project that I got Robson Green to do, and then this project Rebus, which was this Scottish, you know, crime series written, very successful, and so we launched that initially with John Hannah. But I did other things. Did a thing with David Suchet, which was a Deborah Mogach book, quite interesting, about a kidnap. So yeah, a variety of things. Yeah.
We've almost come full circle, because I wanted to ask you about, we started off talking about books and comics, and I wanted to ask you about your own novels and writing for Big Finish, but the clock's against us, so maybe some questions will come up about that. I'm going to dive into the audience though and see who wants to ask Philip a question. Let me bring the microphone just down here. I want to hear your question.
Sorry, trying to get the right distance to get feedback. Obviously we know from this interview, thankfully, that your career has encompassed far more than Doctor Who, which is wonderful. And you said many times that there were advantages and disadvantages to the way that you had to produce Doctor Who, because it was multi-camera, but at the same time you had a stable of classically trained repertory actors that were available, that worked on radio as well, could deliver these wonderful performances, and you also had a wonderful stable of marvellous designers and lighting people, etc. And when you took it over as a enthusiastic young producer, the show had been on for about 10, 12 years, 2 or 3 actors had played the lead role. Okay, so now we have a situation effectively about 12 years ago the series had a reset after 16 years. It's now made in a very different way, single camera, it's made in Cardiff. They may still have strictures on budget, relatively speaking, but to a large sense the way they film it is very different, because obviously it's rehearse, record, etc. I know this is specifically about Doctor Who and not about any other production, but if you were to come in now, say the age you were then, but now, would you accept the brief if you had the choice now of producing Doctor Who now?
What, you mean if I was at the beginning of my producing career?
Yeah, let's say you're given it now, but bearing in mind it's a very different way of making the show, given the way it's sort of evolved over since 2005, since the reset. Let's imagine, effectively, obviously for a lot of young people had never seen it when they first started watching it. Would you accept the brief now? Would you want to produce the show now if you were given it?
But you don't mean at my age now, you mean if I was a young man?
As if you were, because for instance, like Stephen Moffat's about to leave and Chris Chibnall's taking over. Would you want to accept the brief if you...
Oh yeah, I think I would, yeah. I'll tell you why, because I think the show, and it's a very good description you gave, a very good summary of the changes. But what's the same, really, is that I grabbed it when I was offered it, because I recognized that it was a big show. You know, it wasn't a children's show. It had a big following, a big audience, and it was a big important element in the schedule of the BBC. It's almost like it was a drama show, but there was a bit of showbiz about it, if you know what I mean. So it was, I mean, if I'd if my first show if all I'd done was the Muriel Spark Girls of Slender Means. By the way, I cast Mary Tam in that. If that had been my first production, it would have been lovely. But who would have seen it? How, would it have launched me into the limelight? No, I'd have had to do a lot more. Whereas Doctor Who puts you on the front page instantly, and if you make a success of it, that you stay on the front page, really. So it had a sort of excitement about it. And I think I would still feel the same today if this new Who has been running for 10 years. Would you like to have a go at that? Oh, yes, please. This is a big show. In fact, it's much bigger now than it was when I was doing it. And so for those reasons, yeah, of course, it's a huge opportunity, really. It's a major show, yeah.
Thank you very much. Any more questions for Philip?
Good afternoon, Philip. It's a pleasure to meet you. You say, obviously, Tom Maker was a fait accompli for you. He was already cast when you took over. It just occurs to me to ask, if he hadn't already been cast, had you ever thoughts of who you would have cast? And away from Doctor Who, what has been your most rewarding, enjoyable production?
Well, I have no idea who I would have cast, because I didn't know very many actors, actually. I mean, I didn't come... I'm not an actor. I'm not a director. And so it took me a while to build up my knowledge of actors, even when I was producing Doctor Who. So I think I'd have been stymied, really, as to who to cast. I've never really thought that one out, I'm afraid. I might not have had the courage to cast a complete unknown in the way that they had done. So that's all I can say about that. I suppose the two shows I've enjoyed the most, in a way, probably were Doctor Who and The Charmer, because when I was at London Weekend, it wasn't just the show. It was a smaller company. There was a very nice atmosphere within the company, and so it was just a very nice show to do. I'm not saying I haven't enjoyed myself on other shows as well, but that's always stuck in my mind as a very enjoyable, period.
Thank you very much. One more quick question. I'll just come to the back there. There we go.
I was just wondering, what do you think makes a good Doctor Who story? What elements would you put into it when writing them? Yeah.
Excitement, terror, plausible and interesting and mysterious alien or alien elements, and warmth and humour and wit from the relationship between the Doctor and his companion, and an interesting world that you set the story in.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your questions, and thank you to you, Philip.
Can I just say one thing?
Of course, please do.
Because somebody mentioned this to me today. Talking about my career, we missed out a show that was probably one of the shows I'm most proud of, which was in the 79, 80. I did a show called Private Schultz with Ian Richardson and Michael Elphick, which were the best scripts I'd ever been given to produce, even better than the ones I wrote, by Jack Pullman, who'd written I, Claudius. And it was the most funny, wonderful set of scripts. And if ever you get a chance to see that, it's come out on DVD. And the BBC are now launching a thing called BBC Store. And so you will be able to get, download back numbers of shows that are not necessarily even on DVD. But I would urge you to have a look at that one. It's very funny and a brilliant script. And Ian Richardson gives a fantastic performance. That was before, of course, he did the House of Cards, for which he's perhaps better known now.
Thank you very much, and thank you to everyone here. We are sadly out of time. Before we say goodbye to Philip, though, I've got somebody else to introduce you to here on the stage. As you'll know, the DWAS is approaching the end of its, at the end of its 40th anniversary year, and one of its co-founders was Jeremy J. Bentham. So please a round of applause to welcome Jeremy to the stage.
Good afternoon. Hey, it's working. This is a plus start. A few years ago, back in the 70s, a certain fan club was formed about the time that our very esteemed guest here was producing it. It's no exaggeration to say that all the fuel that Barry Letts and Terence Dix put into building an enthusiasm for Doctor Who in the early 70s was set spectacularly alight when Robert Holmes and Philip Hinchliffe took over the series and propelled it to such stellar heights that it was almost impossible for anyone reading any national newspaper to ignore the fact of the show's incredible popularity. It wasn't lost on us. We were all students at the time who shared an interest in Doctor Who, trying desperately, like tonight, to see the episode live on television every time it was broadcast. But we knew to do more than just run a little college appreciation society. If we really wanted to follow the dream and make it a bit more national appeal, we had to write to the BBC. A terrifying experience for people who didn't know their backside from their elbow about how you contact the BBC, much less whether they'd just show us the door, tell us never to darken their towels again, and leave our lack of breeding at the front of Television Centre's entrance. Much to our amazement, we got invited to come to the Doctor Who office to meet with Philip Hinchliffe and Robert Holmes and to share the ideas. Sadly, I was never able to go on that first ever groundbreaking visit, but my two colleagues, the founders of the original society, Jan Vincent Jedski and Stephen Payne, did go along. Much to their amazement, we were treated seriously, told that, yes, quite happy for us to form an appreciation society. And having got that amazing blessing and figured out we weren't the lowest creatures of all, much to our amazement, a few weeks later, there was a little mention in the publicity for The Mask of Mandragora to the effect that the Appreciation Society had viewed the new TARDIS console that Barry Newbury had designed for the series and had approved it. Lucky us. Thank God we didn't turn it down. But, of course, it was that mention in the Radio Times which took the amount of membership applications for the Appreciation Society from about 4 or 5 coming in per week to sackfuls of them arriving per week. And it's what suddenly enabled events like the first convention in 77, the broadening out of the Appreciation Society, all the local groups that followed to come into being. And of course, the Society is still alive and prospering to this day, as you all know, by the very fact that we're here today. None of that would have been possible without the support, help, occasionally advice from the production office as to what we could do, what we couldn't do. But of course, it all came about because of the fact that we adored what was being done on television in every shape or form, what Doctor Who was achieving worldwide in later decades. And so much of that started from where we are with the absolute peak of its achievement in the 70s under Philip Hinchcliffe's tenure. And for some of us, it was not a surprise that it was that much of a success. And when Paul Winter asked me today if I would come along and do this little homage to our guest, I was very privileged because without knowing it, I'd become a fan of Philip's. Even as early as 1971, when Philip was still at ATV, producing a comedy series about a teenager growing up in North London called Alexander the Greatest. I was a teenager growing up in North London, and so it had an amazing resonance. Even more so, a year or so later, when as a geek I recognised the same name, Philip Hinchliffe, attached to a teenage drama series shown sometime about 5 o'clock on Thursday or Friday evenings called the Jensen Code. If any of you have never seen the Jensen Code, all I can say is it's not really children's drama at all. It is far stronger. It's got scripts that touch on elements like brainwashing techniques and physical violence that I think you would never be allowed to put on television at that hour these days. So probably it shouldn't have been too much of a surprise to those of us that grew up with those type of programmes, the sort of heights that would be achieved by Philip and Robert Holmes in Doctor Who, with their stellar cast as well. So there was never ever any doubt in the minds of all the people looking after the Appreciation Society that as part of the closing of our 40th anniversary events, we would very much feel honoured to present Philip with an award for outstanding contribution to Doctor Who, which in every way, shape or form is richly deserved. Ladies and gentlemen.
It's time for me to leave the stage, but that was a real surprise, and I really appreciate everything that Jeremy said. And yes, I think that in the dark days, it was the Doctor Who Appreciation Society and others who sort of, in a way, kept the sort of the flame of the program alive, and then you got your just rewards when it came back so spectacularly. But I will really appreciate and cherish this from the sort of true early fans. I mean, I can remember Jeremy and his companions, and I think they were teenagers coming into my office. So I think I recognised their kind of courage at that time of doing that, but also that they had found something special in the program. And I may be wrong about this, but I think maybe you were the people who said, look, there's a lot of interest in America, you know, as early, you know, from students and people. And so, you know, that the Appreciation Society has had a sort of entwined influence on the program right from the early days. So you deserve an award as well yourselves. But thank you very much for this.